My name is Ryan. I am translation coordinator at the International Institute of Buffalo. I started a program of training for translators specifically. We already have a program for training for interpreters, but we didn't have anything for translators. So I started it last year, and it seems like I have a lot of new faces here, and already some people I know. And it's great to see all of you here. I'm glad we have a good crowd tonight. And today I wanted to talk about, just one second, intro to basic translation theory. What I mean by basic translation theory is not necessarily that nobody knows how to translate, because some people present tonight have been translating for many years. My goal with this training was that I want people to have an idea of what is discussed in the field of translation studies and how this might help you in your translation process, in order to make more informed decisions about your translation or think about things from a different perspective that you haven't thought about before. So that's what I came here to tell you about tonight. It should, I'm not sure exactly how long it's going to last. I picked a few main translation theories that I have come across when I studied, and I will tell you more about my background in just a minute. But anyway, our plan for today is we're just going to have a brief introduction. Then I'm going to talk about terminology, as I usually do. Here we only have a few terms, but it's okay. We'll have more terms as we go through the presentation. Then I'm going to talk about where does theory fit in the translation process. So why study theory when you already basically are bilingual? I'm going to talk about competencies of a translator. So what are the specific skills needed? And we could talk about how we can develop those skills. Then the cognitive process of translation. So what goes on in the translator's mind as they're translating. Then I'm going to talk about Vinay and Darbelnay's model, which is one of the original models from the 1950s for translation, that identifies some strategies and procedures. A lot of the strategies and procedures in Vinay and Darbelnay are something that people do naturally, but identifying them, it might lead to making more conscious choices with them. And then we're going to talk about Scopus theory, which is a huge part of translation studies, which is also a functional theory of translation. So yes, I am going to ask a few questions tonight. And I am counting on people to ask questions themselves if they don't understand something, or if they want clarification, or if they have another issue that might come up. I need your participation, and it's very interesting for me to hear about your language, your culture, and issues that come up specifically when you translate, because with examples, it brings this theory to life, and it makes people think about issues that they might have in their own language. So I encourage you to step up and answer questions that I'm going to ask. So I want to do an introduction, a brief introduction. So if you don't want to speak, you can just write in the chat. If you would like to speak, go ahead. I will start with myself. So my name is Ryan Green. I'm translation coordinator at International Institute of Buffalo. My language pairs, I usually translate from Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian into English. And I have been translating since 2016. I also work with the International Institute as an interpreter, only for Russian. And yeah, that's my experience. Would anybody else like to introduce themselves? Thank you. All right. Thank you for introducing yourself. It was great to meet most of you. Like I said, just write your introductions in the chat at this point. For time's sake, we gotta move on. Oops. So I can tell you what I would like to go over now. Of course, with our terminology, we have source text and target text, source language and target language, and translation versus interpreting. So those are the basic words that I wanted to go over today. What does anybody know what source text and target text means? Yes?
Yes, source text is the text is given to translate. Target text is the language we are translating.
Yes, so source text, in another word, it can be called the original. So what we are given as a translator to put into another language. The target text is the translation itself. So in translation studies, we refer to those two different texts as the source text and the target text. Carrying over, source language is the language that the source text is in, and the target language is the language that the target text is in. So those carry a bunch of factors with them, of course. The source text and the target text can be from completely different cultures, and there are many different considerations that we have in translation. Translation versus interpreting, I believe I'll answer this for you because most people do know the difference, especially if you work in this field. Translation deals with usually with written texts. Sometimes as we move, further into the future, it's more audio-visual that we're talking about. So it's not necessarily a text that we are translating, but usually the main difference is that translation is some sort of content that has already been created in the past, whereas interpreting, it usually refers to something that is happening right now and it's oral. There are many different mediums. There are many different ways that we can translate, and there are also many different ways we can interpret. But usually, translation, as a rule of thumb, is a text. Interpreting is spoken word. So that's basically what I talked about. So where does theory fit in all of this? I have a few questions for you that maybe you could answer. The first question is, what are some requirements for being a translator?
You at first have to be able to communicate in both languages.
Exactly. Very good. Very good requirement. And of course, that is the first prerequisite for translation, is that you are proficient in both languages. Any other requirements for being a translator that you can think of?
You have to be able to write in both the source and the target language.
Yes, of course. Literacy is an important part of being a translator because translators work with words.
And also need to understand the idea, not just translate. Well, need to understand the idea in each country.
Yes, very good, and that's something we're going to talk about too. You have to understand the idea of the source text. Any other requirements?
You need to know the culture of both languages.
Very good, yes, and that's another thing we're going to talk about. You have to be aware of the cultural differences and you have to understand them. Anything else?
To be accurate as much as you can.
Yes, accuracy is very important with being a translator. That ties in with being good at the target language and also the fact that a translator needs to be, first of all, a very good reader. Anything else?
To be honest also.
Yes, that's a very good one. Of course, a translator has to be honest. They have to faithfully reflect what is in the source text, with considerations, of course. But that is a very important part of being a translator, is fidelity and loyalty to the author of the source text. All right, the next question is, being bilingual enough to translate? What do you think?
No, because you have to have some familiarity with the topic that you are translating. So for instance, if you have to translate something that's very technical, so you have to know the language of the field that you're translating into.
Yes, very good. So that is being familiar with a certain domain, whichever domain that this source text exists in, and also the domain, the conventions of the target text that you're translating into. Does anybody else have anything to say about that? Is being bilingual enough to translate?
I would say no, of course, because translation is a very specific skill set. The fact that you can speak in 2 languages doesn't mean you can actually translate.
Yeah, that's a good point. There has been research that if you know, as your proficiency in both your target and whichever languages you speak, as your proficiency goes up, your ability to translate between those languages also goes up. But of course, there are different considerations to look into there. The next question is, what makes a translation quote unquote good? What do you think?
The word that you use.
Okay. The language that you use in the target text.
Also,
Yes.
explain the idea.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Explain the idea with a specific. If it is a specific word, is better, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, translating the idea. That's a very good point. Anybody else?
I tend to think a translation is good when I can barely tell that it is a translation.
Okay, that's a good point. I don't necessarily agree, but it of course depends on which text we're talking about, because sometimes a translation has to be a translation and can be nothing more. And we'll look into that a little bit too. The next question I want to ask, who is qualified to translate? This might be similar to the first one that I said, but I think it's a little bit different. Who is qualified to translate?
I think it would depend on what you mean by qualified. That word could mean something like qualified according to the government, according to a court of law, according to what sector, how they might use that word. There may be an exam associated with certain qualifications.
I agree. When we hear the term qualified translator or certified translator, usually in the United States, that doesn't mean anything at all. In other countries, it does, but here, usually it doesn't. Therefore, asking this question, in our context, is mostly pointless. We could have our own personal qualifications that we think you know, we're good enough to translate. And a lot of people, if they have sufficient knowledge about the source languages and the target languages, in fact, are. One last question I want to ask, because yeah, my time is running quickly. Why do we need translators when Google Translate, or what we would call MT, machine translation, is getting so good? Why do we need translators when I could plug most texts into Google Translate and get, even with some languages that are similar or very close to English, get pretty good results? Why do we need human translators?
Because Google Translate cannot translate culture or ideas. And so that's why it's still, even though we could Google Translate the words, but the general idea of the text is not gonna come through just with Google Translate or any other translator.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. Even with languages where Google Translate usually has pretty good results, Nonetheless, Google Translate is sometimes unable to be consistent throughout the text. Google Translate might not understand the idea behind the text and only translates the words. Google Translate is getting better, and most people who have used it have probably noticed that machine translation is in fact getting better. But nonetheless, in many sectors of translation, Google Translate would never be appropriate to use. I would, of course, say that Google Translate mostly is not appropriate to use. Some forms of MT, machine translation, are, but of course, every text that goes to a client or that people are going to read, unless they're getting the bare information, must be looked at least looked at, if not totally translated, by a human translator. So answering these questions, this is why I think theory fits in. This is the justification for today, is that a lot of these things have to somehow be defined. And the hope for theory is that we can answer these questions ourselves. When we get a translation task, we should be able to answer questions. How do I create a translation that's good, basically? So our definition of good, of course, will change from project to project, but nonetheless, we should be able to define what a successful translation is. And that is where theory fits in. So some important rules for all translators, and of course, I'm going to have the theory that concerns these rules attached. Use your best judgment, like I said before. Use your best judgment to produce a translation based on your knowledge of the target audience and the purpose of your translation. So this is what we're going to talk about, Scopus theory, toward the end of our training today. These are, of course, what we should be thinking about each time. Who is going to actually be reading this text? And adjust your target text accordingly. We have to be able to generate several different versions of your target text and decide which is most appropriate for your given audience. That, of course, there's a lot of overlap with theory, but this is something slightly different. We are not talking about, obviously, translating a bunch of, making a bunch of target texts, but while you are translating, maybe thinking about different words, different ways of wording something, different ways of conveying ideas, and deciding which is most appropriate. Adopt several linguistic approaches to your translation, incorporating linguistic and cultural adjustments to the target text as dictated by target text norms. So this is what we're going to be talking about with Vinay and Darbelnay. These might be mostly things that we already do subconsciously when we're translating. Different things that we use in order to generate a target text, but we're going to talk about them today with Vinay and Darbelnay, and then get a sense of what the translation is saying, and then create a new version. This is the cognitive approach. It's also known as deverbalizing. We'll talk a bit about that too. This is something that's used more with interpreting, but I think since a lot of people here do already work as interpreters, this might be something useful for us to transfer to our translation as well. So I would first like to start by talking about competencies of the translator. A lot of you already answered these and came up with these exact choices that we're going to explore. So you see I have 8, maybe there's an extra one that can be called 9, and we will talk about them today. So the first one, of course, is source language competence. Somebody, I don't remember who, mentioned that this is our first, the most important thing is understanding the text that we are reading. This is, of course, central to translation. You must be able to understand what is said in the source language, in the source text. Not just the words, but of course, what is behind the words. Because that is important in transferring the message from the source text to the target text. So we can talk about reading between the lines, because not necessarily what is said in the source text is what is physically going to be present in the target text. So we should be able to decipher indirectness and, like I said, read between the lines. Why might this be an issue between different languages? One of the reasons is, on our next slide, one of the reasons is that when you're translating between different languages, we have a difference in culture, and of course that is reflected in the language. So we have what is called high context cultures and low context cultures. Usually places like the United States, Germany, are what are known as low context cultures. More collective societies in East Asia, for example, are more on the high end. Of course, it varies between your level in society. It even varies between countries or cultures within a civilization. So I have a statement here that would be reflected in the high context culture. If somebody sees something that they don't quite agree with, they might say something like, there are many ways to approach this problem. That is a high context statement because the receiver of that message should be able to derive the meaning that the speaker is not necessarily approving of whatever they are talking about. A low context statement, like I said, this is something that might be found in a culture like the United States. Germany would say, you made a mistake. This is how it must be done correctly. So it's much more direct. I have a short video here, somebody describing the difference between these. Let me know if you can hear.
Society, while we are communicating, we assume that we have a low level of shared context. What does that mean? It means that we don't have the same reference points or the same body of knowledge or relationships, that we have a low level of shared context. So in a low context society, we believe that good, effective, professional communication is a communication that's very explicit, that's very simple and very clear. In a low context society, we're trained that if I want you to understand blue, then I have to say blue, literally. We're trained in a low context culture that if I give a presentation, I should tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I should tell you, and then I should tell you what I've told you. Why do I tell you the same thing 3 times? Because we're focused overall on making sure that the message was passed simply and clearly. In a high context society, while we're communicating, we assume or consider that we have a larger body of shared context, that we have the same reference points, body of knowledge, information, and because we assume all of this shared context, in a high context society, we believe good, effective communication is a communication that's more implicit or layered or nuanced. I had a German individual who said to me, you know, Erin, in Germany, at the end of a meeting, we almost always do a recap. First, we do a verbal recap, and then we do a written recap. That's low context, right? Clarification, clarification, clarification. He said, now that I've been working frequently with the French, I often find that at the end of a meeting, I'll get ready to do a recap, and my French colleagues will just stand up, and someone will say, et voila, there it is. And I'll think to myself, but voila what? And then I'll be very surprised to see that it just seems that people know what's been decided, that they know what's supposed to happen next, without going through all of those levels of clarification that I'm so used to in my own culture. I had a second example. I was doing some work a while ago in Istanbul, and I had a Turkish client who was telling me about all of these issues that he was having with his new American boss. And I said, when your boss was here, did you tell him what you're telling me now? And he said, well, you know, Erin, I made it known so that he could see it if he wanted to see it. And I thought to myself, he probably didn't see it, right? I'll give you a third example from China. I was giving a presentation at a conference in China last year, and all the people in the room worked for the same multinational American company. Before I worked with them, the chairman, who was this American from New York City, gave a presentation that went very well, and then he left. Afterwards, when I was working with the group, we were talking about this, and I had the Chinese human resource director raise his hand, and he said, you know, Erin, this concept is very interesting to me, because the whole time the chairman was talking, I was trying to make sure that I was listening with all of my senses, that I was picking up all of the levels of meaning that he might be trying to pass. And now that I look at this, I'm asking myself the question, is it possible that there was no meaning beyond that, you know, first those simple words that he was saying? And I thought to myself that that chairman would have been really surprised to think that anyone was trying to understand his message beyond the first degree.
Okay, so that is what I wanted to. I wanted to make a distinction between different types of culture. Maybe you notice this in your own culture or in any study, in any languages that you have studied, any cultures that you have studied, that this is this might be an issue that we run into. What are the implications this might have in translation? Does anybody have an idea?
I think it could be, for example, in literary translation, if perhaps like a work of literature is being translated from, let's say, American English to, let's say, maybe Japanese, where they're much more concerned with being polite and deferring and not being direct about things that make you uncomfortable. Certain ways of saying things might be considered, they might perceive a character to be incredibly rude. Whereas, you know, somebody like an American reading it, for example, might not bat an eye at the text.
Yeah, right, exactly. There's it might not necessarily, it definitely would be present in literary translations. It might also be in, I could see it in other types of translations. Let's say somebody writes a statement about something, maybe like in Spanish or something, and they said, I don't know, I went to you know where. Well, maybe a Spanish speaker would understand what that means, but an American reader of the English might not necessarily understand what they mean. So there are some considerations there. Does anybody have any other ideas what implications this might have in translation?
Okay, I can share a little bit. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, the clip is very interesting. Basically, what you said is for the English, most of the time it's very direct, right? So, but I'm Chinese, okay? So I translate from Chinese to English. For Chinese, when you translate the text, really you have to understand the deep meaning and the culture things. I just give one very simple example. For example, if the school wants to write a letter or whatever, write something about how to educate the children, right? One thing, they will not allow the children to read anything, the pornography, right? But in Chinese language, we don't say pornography, this word, we say yellow book, right? So if you don't know the Chinese, the culture, or don't know the real meaning, right, then you cannot translate it, because yellow book, we thought, oh, just a yellow book. It's not. For us, yellow stuff, yellow book, yellow a photo, or yellow video, whatever, refer to pornography, right? So that is very interesting. I watched the clip. I totally understand what she said, right? So you have to know behind the words, right? What's the real meaning, right? It's not just the surface, right? The word itself. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very interesting example. And actually, in English, we do use the word yellow in a limited negative meaning similar to that, like when we say yellow journalism, but it definitely does not have it. No, but it definitely does not have the context of pornography. So that's an interesting example. And yes, I think that definitely folds in with high context cultures like China, where you would say a word like that rather than actually saying the word, and it's understood by universally. Whereas in a low context culture, like in the United States, we're more used to this legalese text where this sort of jargon, but very specific, would be applied to this situation. In fact, if we're talking about the word pornography, it would be present in that statement. Thank you for the example. That's very interesting. Does anybody else have any other examples?
I can think of something, and I never thought about this. I had heard of high and low context cultures before, but I hadn't thought about how it might apply to translation. So that's really fascinating. I was thinking about the use of commands. It kind of goes along here. Some languages are more likely, or some sectors of that society are more likely to use commands. And in others, it will come off as rude if you don't couch that command in some kind of other language, or change the conjugation to something else so it's not a command any longer. So that occurred to me as a way that you could, I don't know if that's a good example of high-low context, but
no, I think it is a good example. But also, interestingly enough, in our culture, I'm talking about in United States American culture, it's more in terms of trying to get somebody to do something. I think it more relates to the high context, as in we try to avoid direct commands because they're considered rude. But in Russia, for example, which is, I think, more of a high context culture, saying direct commands is how you tell somebody to do something. So that's interesting, and it seems like in that case it's sort of the opposite, but nonetheless it results.
Yeah, I've also noticed a difference. Like, I feel like East Coast US uses maybe more commands, direct commands, than Midwesterners, and I've felt that difference when I've interpreted between, for an East Coast professional. Sometimes I feel like I'm being rude if I say it exactly the way they say it, even though it's my job to interpret, tone and everything when I interpret. But sometimes I feel my own tendency to want to soften it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that's actually, I mean, in terms of even just within a single culture, there might be different expectations depending on the geography. Very interesting. Okay, let's move on, because I think we need to start talking about something else, just for time's sake. So another thing that we also talked about earlier was target language competence, of course. So your ability to be able to write well in the language you're translating into. So you have to be able to produce a valid text in the target language, of course. And that text must formulate the source text message in the target text. So we must have good writing skills, first of all. This folds in with the appropriate use of register. I'll just tell you, maybe you're not familiar with this word. Register means basically the level of language. So whether it's somebody speaking on the street, or it's the language that you find in the law, for example. Of course, you're going to use different levels of words, and that is register. This sort of is related to when we're translating something, whether or not we use layman's terms or we use the fancy terminology that is related to that text. That's when we're thinking about our target audience. So thinking about your target audience also, of course, is related to target text competence. Narrowing down our choices that we generated, and knowledge, of course, of our audience and the purpose of the text. This is an interesting question that I wanted to ask. Do you think that target language competence has to be exactly equal to your source language competence? And saying that in other words, should the translator be able to translate in both directions?
I'm going to say no on this one because I know for certain that I would not be able to translate into French. Whether it be like my confidence or just knowing that I wouldn't be able to get it accurate.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know. I translate from English to Spanish, and I believe that you have to be able to translate in both directions.
Okay.
I feel that you can, I mean, translate to just one side and not being able to like reciprocate. It's kind of like makes me feel, do I really know this language enough to translate it? Or do I know just my target language that way?
Okay. Okay. Anybody else?
I think that having the same level of competency in both languages is far more important for interpreters, but I think for translators, it's much more common and I guess I would say even acceptable to have a higher level of competence in your L1 than your L2.
Okay. That's all a lot of good input, and actually I would tend to agree with the stance that it is acceptable to be more competent in one language that you are translating into than the other. Certainly in interpreting, that you have to be able to speak both languages, and in terms of target language competence, that requires a different skill set. When we are translating, we are saying that we are proficient in many different skill sets, including not just being well-versed in the target language, whichever one that may be, but also we understand text type conventions, and we are able to use the language accurately. So in the United States, generally, the requirement is that you should only translate into your native language. In other countries, the expectation is usually you should be able to translate both ways. So in Europe, for example, that is usually the requirement. But like I said, in the United States, usually in terms of translation, you should only translate into your native language. That's not always the case that can be done. And also there are a good amount of people who reach full bilingual proficiency in both languages so that they can translate between them. But like I said, usually the expectation is that you translate only into your target language. And this requires a different skill set. That's why this is a different competence than source language competence. Let's go on. Transfer competence. So this is your ability to make appropriate decisions to adapt the target text to suit an audience. Right here is something called the translation brief is very important here. With a translation brief is basically a message that includes what you're doing the translation for, who your target audience is, and what the purpose is. Everything is defined. Of course, most translators do not get a brief when they are given a translation task, and therefore they have to basically create a brief for themselves. It doesn't necessarily have to be a piece of paper. It doesn't necessarily have to be written down. In most translation, you just get a text and they say, we need this text in this language. So therefore we don't use a brief. However, like I said, you should have a brief in your mind. Who am I translating this for? And what is the purpose of this text? Where is it going to be used? Where do I imagine it's going to be? We'll discuss Pym's minimalist approach a little bit later. We also need textual competence in order to translate. So to produce an appropriate target text that meets the audience's expectations as well as the target language norms. So that is being familiar with all the different text types that we could have. You know how in the target language legislation sounds. You know how the tone of the novel should be that you're translating. You know the sort of language that is used that maybe parents at a school should be reading. What the expectation is there. How can we develop textual competence? How do we know how to fit our target text so that it looks like the source text? How would we be able to find the right terminology? How would we be able to know how the text should look like? How can we develop that competence? Does anybody have any idea?
I'll say reading about, let's say if it's something that has to do with talking to parents, then you will read other letters in that language and see how they are written, so that you could kind of follow the same.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly the answer I was looking for. We would consult what is called parallel text. This is something that every translator should know how to do, and it's very important. A parallel text is a text that aligns with the target text in terms of audience, genre, and purpose. For example, if you get a birth certificate and you've never translated a birth certificate before, or if it's a set of instructions about sewing or anything else that you can think of, if it's you know, instructions to drive a car, something like that, you need to find a text that is the same thing, the same exact thing in the target language, the same text, the same audience, the same genre, and the same purpose, and use that as a reference. That's how we can develop textual competence. That is how, if you get a text that you've never had before, you're unfamiliar with the terminology, so you will consult parallel texts. You will see what is the terminology used, how is the whole thing laid out, and try to basically bring everything together to make a target text that has the same audience, genre, and purpose. Sometimes, let's say let's say you are translating instructions for operating a machine, and that machine helps build cars or something. Well, maybe you can't find the same parallel text. You would consult what is called a background text so that you can get the terminology. So a background text, if you're translating, you know, instructions for how to drive a car, maybe a background text could be a driver manual or something like that. Something that has the same terminology, a way that you can learn about this field that could help you write your translation, your target text. Of course, intercultural, somebody said this, intercultural competence is very important. So knowing both the source language and the target language, the context that the cultures are in. High versus low context culture, some shared experiences. So let's think about, for example, if you're translating from Persian to Arabic, so let's say Farsi to Arabic or Farsi to English. What would be the difference? A lot of terms, since generally, for example, Farsi and Arabic are from similar part of the world, the same part of the world, and they share things like religion to a certain extent. There might be some shared experiences there. Whereas if you're translating from Farsi into English, then there's a lot more cultural distance there. So that's something else to keep in mind, to be able to know both cultures. Same thing from French to English versus French to Chinese. The distance of the culture. French to English, you know, generally they're from the same civilization, so there might be some overlap in terms of translation. Even there's a shared writing system that might help in a lot of ways. Whereas French to English are from very different civilizations. Subject area competence. So this is background. Yes.
on the like there is a good example Arabic to other languages, which I don't know other language that comes to from right to the left. Arabic is written from right to the left, but other language mostly we write from left to the right.
Mm-hmm.
So there could be sometimes a confusion on formatting, especially when it comes into translation. But
Oh, yes, of
interpretation
course.
probably would be wording. And the
Mm-hmm.
second part is um, a country that was colonized by another country, which 100 years ago. Well, then that country has some uh, footprint of that colonization culture and language, and then this country may use some words, direct transferred words, especially towards technology, called or uh, modifications. Not, and then there might be the same word being used, and then when you're interpreting, sometimes you may face you are saying the same word that I said. Did you really you really translate or interpret it? And then you may say, like in our language, manca is the same manca in Italy, bunny is the same bunny in Italy, which we don't translate it. Well, then in America also, right now in English, computer we don't translate it. It's a computer. So I just want to lay off so we can have a picture of some
Yeah,
language.
that's a good point, and definitely colonization has a
Thank
effect
you.
on the language. Yeah, thank you. Definitely
I appreciate it.
colonization
My name is
has.
Benjista Haidemiram from Eritrea, by the way. So I'm sorry. I was just...
It's okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your example. Yeah, I think those are good examples. Colonization definitely has an effect on language and the relation between languages, especially who the colonizer is versus who the colony is. Um, so that's something definitely to take into consideration when you're translating between languages. Of course, you have to be competent in a certain subject area. So background knowledge of a domain. Let's say you're translating legal texts, a lot of legal texts with a lot of highly legalized language. You should know something about that. So how can we develop our subject area competence?
Read.
Yes, very good. Read. That's probably the easiest and usually more cheap. That's the cheaper way of doing it. Another way that a lot of people do, so translators will specialize only in one subject area, and they will have a degree in that area. So they will only take legal text between, let's say, Italian and English, and they will have a degree, or they will have taken a course or something like that. In that language. Yes, read or take courses. Usually that's the biggest way in which you can develop subject area competence. Who is a better translator? Sorry?
Cultural immersion definitely helps. Coming into contact with the bureaucratic paperwork of that country.
Yeah,
the language related to it.
That does help in more ways than just subject area competence in general, like improving your language. Yeah. So what do you think? Who is a better translator? And there's not necessarily a correct answer here. Who is a better translator? A trained translator in working in a new domain, so let's say legal text, or a bilingual lawyer?
I'm going to say the trained translator.
Okay, why do you say that?
Well, I'm an interpreter, and like, we've seen it's not, being bilingual is not enough. You have to be able to explain the terminology in the other language. You have to be able to know the terminology. I've been working as a medical interpreter lately, and you see that all the time when you have bilingual staff that cannot interpret because they do not have the training. So I guess that with the translator is the same. A bilingual lawyer might be really good at what they do, but they do not have the actual training to maybe put whatever whatever word is in a better context?
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. And that's what I would say as well. The trained translator, the assumption is that the translator knows how to become a proficient in a certain field, in a certain domain. A bilingual lawyer doesn't necessarily know how to do that. Doesn't know how to. They might not know the terminology, and they're probably not very good. Not necessarily, but they're probably not very good at transfer, which is a very important part of being a translator. They don't necessarily know about finding parallel texts. They don't necessarily know about doing research in order to do translations. So we also have to be good at research when we're translators. So finding our information for a translation, being able to locate those parallel texts, use dictionaries accurately, and also being able to critically view consulted information. So let's say, the translator said, well, the dictionary, glossary, parallel text, Google Translate said this, so it must be right. Of course, as translators, we should be able to look at that and decide, okay, this is what the dictionary said, but it's not necessarily the appropriate term to use in this context. So that is another competence that we can use. Let's see. Technological competence, this is a big one, of course, being able to use the software for translation. For a lot of our translators, it's, using Word, which is fine. Being able to format, at least basic, Word documents. Working with software if necessary, for example, CAT tools. And doing this, you can enhance your quality and also your productivity. So you have templates for different types of documents, and it'll make your job a lot easier. So moving on to some theory, this is PIM's minimalist approach to translation. The translator must be able to generate a number of viable potential target texts and select which target text is most appropriate for the situation for our target audience, keeping the purpose of the text in mind. That is understanding that this is where target language competence comes in. This is where we know the different levels, we know the registers of the target language that we're translating into, and we can select the most appropriate register, the most appropriate terminology for the text. That is PIM's minimalist approach. So looking very briefly into the history of translation, it's sometimes said within the field of translation studies that translator is the world's second oldest profession. Ha ha ha. Please don't ask what's the first. Some works from history that have been translated. I mean, I can think of biblical religious texts, for example. Those are some of the earliest texts that have been translated. And very firmly, those translations have taken a very firm stance in very firm place in almost every society. And those are all translated texts. Most of them come from different languages. Then, one of the first questions that arose in translation before even the field of translation studies came about is, do we do word for word translation or sense for sense translation? So we have here St. Jerome, who is the translator of the Vulgate, the classic Bible translation to Latin. And he said, I render not word for word, but sense for sense in 395. So why did St. Jerome reject the word for word approach? Probably because it's not necessarily appropriate in most cases. It basically breaks the structure of the target language to translate. So if he's translating the Bible, which is mostly in Greek, if you use Greek sentence structure and Greek idioms and Greek everything in Latin, it usually does not work out. And I think most people can say that for the languages, their language pairs, that a word for word translation is not necessarily appropriate. Some people, I've been asked in the past, is this a literal translation or an idiomatic one? I don't think that question is necessarily appropriate, because simply because the translator has to make different decisions each time that they're translating, so that you can't really necessarily call an entire target text a literal translation or an idiomatic one. So I wanted to start with our Vinay and Darbelnet model. These are our two French scholars who performed a stylistic analysis of French and English and produced translation strategies and procedures. Like I said, most of these you do intuitively, but nonetheless, it's useful to name them so that we can see what we're doing while we are translating. This is one of the foundation, I guess, texts of translation theory. They created two general strategies, direct translation, so what we would say literal, and oblique translation, or sense for sense. So our direct translation, they came up with three strategies. The first one is borrowing. This is a form of non-translation, so we use the source text word transferred directly into the target text. Can anybody think of examples of this? Well, I'll tell you some examples. Rupee, Tsar, Chic, Sushi, Pierogies, and Perestroika. What is the purpose of borrowing, do you think?
When there is not a word for that thing in the target language or the language you're translating into?
Yes, exactly. So usually there is no word for it. However, I think there's a word for most of these in English. So rupee, not necessarily, but you could say dollar, tsar, it could be a king. Perestroika is rebuilding or restructuring. Pierogies are dumplings. What's the point of borrowing in this case?
Maybe to impart a sense of specialness on that item.
Yeah, that's what I would say. It's keeping a certain local flavor to it, and also there's something different between pierogies and dumplings, right? Maybe we use the word dumplings for something we would find in Chinese cuisine, and pierogies is quite specific to Polish cuisine. So that's usually the purpose for borrowing. The next one that we use is an interesting one. It's called calque. So this is where we take a source expression and translate it directly. There are many different examples of this, and actually calquing leads to neologisms in a language, and usually they're just universally adopted. That's why I think they're very interesting. So some of the examples are Adam's apple, which actually comes directly from French, pomme d'Adam, or the Milky Way, which is a Latin term, Via Lactea. Does anybody have any other examples of calquing? Sometimes hard to come up with them, but unless you know the etymology of certain words or expressions. Then we have literal translation. This is what Vinay and Darbelnet say is basically what the most common way of translating. The example is, you see, the English is here and it's the same as the French. However, literal translation does not work with a lot of languages that have completely different syntax. So this is also something that is used as a criticism of Vinay and Darbelnet's strategies, is that it works well for French English, but it doesn't necessarily work well for French Chinese because there are different considerations there. Next, let's do it next. Okay. These are our oblique translations, and this is actually where translation gets a little more interesting. This is when we actually do change things in the process of translating. So one example is transposition. We change one part of speech to another. Sometimes it's optional and sometimes it's obligatory. For example, in English, we say I am afraid. Afraid is an adjective. In Spanish, you say tengo miedo. Miedo means fear, and it's a noun. So that's an example of transposition. We change the part of speech. Then we have modulation, where we change the semantics in point of view. So we switch things around. We switch things around a little bit. So I don't have actual translations here, but here's an example of it. In the source language, you might say it's not difficult to show. In the target language, you would negate it and say it's easy to show. Maybe you could say you could have it, and then in the target language, you would say I will give it to you. In the source language, you'd say it's raining. In the target language, maybe, like for example, in Polish, you say rain is falling. In Russian, you say rain is going. So there are different ways you can express things like that. That's called modulation. The next one is my favorite, simply because you have to say it with the French word, équivalence, or idiomatic translation. So we have the same situation, but we have to adapt it to the target language. I could think of an example from Russian. From Russian, you say льет как из ведра, which means it pours like from a bucket. And in English, usually in that case, we would say it's raining cats and dogs. Does anybody have any examples of this? Well, okay, maybe you can think of it later and you can tell us. And the next one is adaptation. This is an interesting one, adaptation, because sometimes you have to completely change a cultural symbol or a reference to something. So an example is a reference to American football might be switched to, in many countries, a reference to soccer. I can think of another example, and I'm going to have it on here. This is not necessarily a textual change, but of course it relates to translation. So it's going to show up on the screen. So this is from the movie, what is it called? What is it called? Inside Out or something like that. In the American version, the girl is eating broccoli and she doesn't want to eat it. However, when the movie was adapted for Japan, broccoli is not a hated vegetable as it is in American culture. So it was replaced with bell peppers, with green peppers here, as you can see. She doesn't want to eat the green peppers. That's a very good example of an adaptation. Like I said, not necessarily in textual form, but nonetheless an adaptation. And sometimes in translation, it's important to do that. One more, this is not a part of the 7, but it's also, in my opinion, it's, in my opinion, a very important part of translation. It's called explicitation. So when we have implicit information in the source text, we have to render it explicit in the target text. So when we have, maybe we can borrow a term. We could use the first one, borrowing. We don't know how to translate something, so we borrow it. And then we basically add a very short explanation as to what it is. This is very important when translating across cultures. So one example is this is an implicit explicitation. So when we say the doctor explained, in many languages, people, professions, they are gendered, and therefore you have to reveal the gender of the person you're talking to. Another example of explicitation is simply saying what something is. So if in the source text in English, let's say, they met for Thanksgiving. Well, most English speakers understand what Thanksgiving is, but if you're going to translate it into another language, you might have to explain what it is. So that is an example of explicitation, a holiday celebrated in the United States in November. Does anybody have any questions?
Just a quick comment that machine translation would never think to do this.
Very good, yes. Or machine translation might literally translate something. Like I've seen machine translation Yeah, it would literally translate a word or expression, whereas a borrowing from English would be the more appropriate selection in that case. And I'm sure most people have seen that, and it's quite funny when it happens. Any other questions or comments? Okay, moving along. Like I said, the criticism is that they work well for French English, but not necessarily for languages that are further apart from each other. Now we're going to talk a bit about the cognitive process of translation. This is what is known as deverbalization. For people who have worked as interpreters, this is quite useful because you already deverbalize. So you start with reading and understanding. This is like when you're interpreting, you're listening to the message. Like I said, anybody who has been in that position, I'm not sure a lot of people here necessarily have, but maybe you have, even if informally, you're listening to what this person is saying. In your mind, you understand the message. You're not necessarily listening to the words. So that's when you're using your linguistic competence and knowledge to grasp the sense of the source text. So we're extracting the explicit and implicit meaning of the message. Then we deverbalize in our head. This is when we're talking about interpreters, and we're saying that the interpreter understands the sense of what the person said, not necessarily the message exactly. Then we re-express that sense that we have in our head, and the target text is reformulated based on this deverbalized sense. An important step is, of course, verification. So after we translated, we make sure that we got all of the sense of the source text. This is an interesting crossover between translation and interpreting, when we are basically saying that we are translating the sense of the text and not necessarily the words. One issue that a lot of translators have, especially new translators, is that they're paying too much attention to the specific words, so that the target text is rendered not very readable, or it's clear that it's a translation. And that's why this is an important process. Does anybody have any questions about the cognitive process of translation? All right, we'll move on. The last big theory that I wanted to go over is called Scopus theory. It's a big part of translation studies. It was developed in the 1970s by Hans Vermeer, and it is a theory, it's a functional theory of translation. So what are we, how it's asking about the adequacy of the translation in translating for a purpose. So when we're looking at scopus, scopus is a word that means purpose or aim in Greek. The first rule of Scopus theory, and it's going to get really translationese, or it's going to get really theoretical here, but I'll explain everything that's being said. The first rule of Scopus is that a translational action is determined by its scopus. So whenever we're translating anything, we are having the scopus, or the purpose, in mind. That is the umbrella over all of the rules that we're going to have. Number two, an offer of information in a target culture in target language concerning an offer of information in the source culture and the source language. This is relating the target language and the source language together. This is taking the source text and making it relate to the target text and the target language in the relative cultural context. Number three, it does not offer information in a clearly reversible way. That's kind of hard to grasp, but it's basically what this means is that the target text doesn't have necessarily the same function as the source text. That means, for example, if we're translating something and making it either a gist translation or not preserving the terminology so that it's more understandable to a layperson, then it's not the same as the source text. That is what Rule 3 means. They're not necessarily the same exact thing. Number 4, the target text must be internally coherent. I'll explain that in just a second, but I think it's more or less understood. It has to be understood to the target text reader. And the target text must be coherent with the source text. That's when we're going back to our basic fidelity to the source text. So they must say the same thing, not necessarily using the same terms, not necessarily for the same audience, but they have to say the same thing. The rules are hierarchical, with the Scopus rule dominating. So we're always looking at what is our purpose of Scopus. What is our Scopus of the translation? Does anybody have questions about this?
I think for me personally, like this one I think is probably the one that this theory requires like the most research after this class.
Yeah. It's not necessarily always agreed to, and there are some criticisms which I'm going to explore right now. But basically, the Scopus theory says that, and especially the rules 4 and 5, say that a translation must be functionally adequate. What does that mean? So relating to 4, the coherence rule, it must be translated in a way that makes sense for the target text receivers. So let's say, for example, you are translating a piece of legislation with a bunch of legalese in it, and you're translating it for people who aren't lawyers. Well, according to Scopus theory, you're going to have to use a lot of explicitation. You're going to have to use a lot of layperson's terms in order to create a translation that is coherent, because we're thinking about our purpose and our target audience. Relating to Rule 5, it's called the fidelity rule. So the target text must be translated in a way that the source text information the translator receives, then interprets what the source text message is, and then re-encodes it for the target text receivers. And that kind of goes back to the deverbalization that we were talking about before. There are a few criticisms of this theory. So, for example, we can ask the question, does the translator have absolute license when translating? I would argue that no, the translator doesn't. The translator certainly owes something to the author of the source text, especially when it gets to when we're talking about, legal requirements. And that's where does the loyalty to the author's intentions come in? Just because you have to make something understandable to your target text audience doesn't necessarily mean that you have to sacrifice something from the source text. But the advantages to this are you can adopt different techniques for different situations. So, for example, if there's an ambiguity found in a will that was written in French, how would this situation be dealt with in a legal setting? So if we have Scopus theory in mind, we would probably leave the ambiguity in the text, and then in maybe a translator's note, tell whoever the target audience is that this is ambiguous, that somebody who is reading this in French would not fully understand what is said. If it's used in a novel, maybe we would use a different approach to that, especially if that might affect the plot somehow. Does anybody have any questions?
On the case of people from city versus people from village. What do I mean is, when I say people from city, I'm talking about the target language. People who grew up with an access of TV, radio, newspaper, or foreigner tourism involvement cities. And there are also movies and theater areas where they can engage it. And those people sometimes have a hard time. They mix the language. Well, then when you are trying purely to interpret to their native language, well, then you confuse them back by their own language.
Well, certainly, and
sometimes you're gonna balance the language if you understand them, and then you set back. Then, especially in English, you speak a mixing. Well, then they completely understand you. Realize that you are involving a little bit difficulty. Which word is going to fit to them? Unless you understand them exactly, then you can have a little bit challenge. When the people come from village, well, they didn't involve with those, what I mentioned it early, then you're gonna need to go deeply even to interpret every sentence towards their language so they can understand exactly what you mean. Because they don't have the English access or the Italian access. They only speak their language.
Right, yes, that's a good point. Of course, and this is when Scobo's theory would come into play, because in this case, we have a target audience that does not that might not necessarily understand the target text, and therefore, well, according to Rule 4 of Scobo's theory, the target text has to be adjusted so that the target audience can understand it somehow. And it's up to the translator. It's at the translator's discretion to decide what is going to be understood, what has to be explained, what has to be said in a different way, in order for the text to serve its purpose for its target audience. One last thing I wanted to talk about is this term of translationese. So should a translation seem like a translation? We could consider a couple texts. So if we're talking about a novel or literary work, should it seem like a translation? I would venture to say, or not even venture to say, novels should definitely not look like a translation. It should read very smoothly in the target language. A birth certificate, on the other hand, if it's a translation of a birth certificate, it will always be a translation of a birth certificate. It will never serve the purpose of the actual birth certificate, because a translation of a birth certificate should always accompany the original birth certificate. What about something like a lecture? I would say not necessarily. It should read smoothly as to somebody who could understand it. How about an advertisement?
Definitely not.
Well, yeah, an advertisement has extra considerations. For example, maybe color schemes or cultural references have to be completely changed. And an advertisement would never be something that's simply translated. It would have to be adapted. A will. Should it seem like a translation?
Yes.
Yeah, in this case, I would say not necessarily it should read like translationese, but nonetheless, the legality of the document is that it is a translation of another document and therefore should always accompany that document. A report, not necessarily, but you have to keep all of the information. A film, once again, in certain cases, it has to be culturally adapted instead of just translated. And that has a lot of considerations, like we saw with that movie Inside Out, with the change in vegetable. One last thing I wanted to talk about is text typology different text types have different, I would say, scopos involved. So if something is expressive, then we're trying to stray away from translationese and make it as appropriate to the target language culture as possible. So a poem or a play, for example, have to be adapted, even if not just translated. Something that is operative, that's trying to get somebody to do something. So an advertisement is trying to get somebody to buy something. A speech, an electoral speech, is trying to get somebody to vote for somebody. That has other considerations when we're talking about translation. If something is informative, then perhaps this has to be closest to the original. So all we are doing here is we are trying to let somebody know what this document says. So reference work, report, lecture, like I said, birth certificate, any sort of official document, that has to be informative. There's also nowadays, since Katarina Rice wrote this in 1976, there was no consideration for audio medial text. So we're talking about films and other things like that that might get translated nowadays. That's also another consideration. To recap, and we'll turn to questions, the bottom line is, and here I am with my with my low context culture, laying down the rules and then telling you about them and then summing them up again. Of course, use your best judgment to produce a translation based on knowledge of the target audience and the purpose of your translation. So that's our Scopos theory. Be able to generate different target texts. So knowing the different levels, the different registers, and the different text types, and being able to produce the most appropriate one. That's our minimalist theory by Pym. Adopt several different linguistic approaches to your translation, incorporating linguistic and cultural adjustments. That is, Binet and Darbonnais are different ways of translating, whether it be borrowing, calquing, direct translation, or actually adapting the text a little bit so that it's more appropriate in the target language. And then trying to get a sense of what a translation is in your head, deverbalizing, that is getting the sense, and then creating a new version that is, like I said, appropriate for the target text and for the target audience. That's our cognitive approach. Does anybody have any questions?
If I translate the medical words, and you know, if some medical words is so difficult, what I do if I didn't understand?
So what do you do if you have a text type that is new to you? So first of all, we use some of our competencies, which is research, and our domain, our subject area knowledge. And that is developed by consulting background texts just in general. So whether it be taking courses or reading, or in the moment, in the process of translation or pre-translation, consulting parallel texts. So if there's a big, if there's a medical report, for example, and it's regarding a certain patient or something, try to find an example of a medical report with this, you know, maybe from the same clinic or from the same type of medicine, and using that as a parallel text.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
I wanted to share something that I thought might be helpful for a lot of people. There, in the beginning of me doing translation, which was a lot of birth certificates from Spanish to English, and anybody here who is a Spanish speaker knows how wonderfully complex bureaucratic Spanish can be from country to country to country, and how wildly different the way they phrase things are in other countries. And I spent a lot of time researching the way things were phrased from different countries. And one place that I found a lot of texts for comparing English to Spanish translations, and it has a lot of other languages there too, is Lingui.com. It does have, you know, a dictionary and things like that, but it had quite a database of side-by-side texts translated from one language to the other. It doesn't have every language, but it, you know, it does have a lot of them. So, you know, if you're not finding what you need, or you're really struggling with like one word that is used in just this one country, and you want to make sure you get the context right, just keep searching and looking for it. Prosy.com is another great place to search for crowdsourced translations, and you know, sometimes there's a lot of conversation on certain terms and the way they're translated.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree.
Really fun too.
Yeah, those are great resources that, of course, I use as well, and they can be a good place to look up some of those terms that might be giving you difficulty, that you can't necessarily find a translation for or an equivalent for. Other translators who have run into the same problem can offer you advice.
I have a question. How do you get started as a translator without prior translation experience?
So you can start by working with different agencies. You can take different training programs. That's one thing I could do. And like I said, send out your information to different agencies. A lot of them will provide you with a test to see what you can translate, how well you can translate according to their standards. And also usually they ask for your rates. So it would be useful to do some research into how much your language pair is, what the typical rates are for it. Definitely don't sell yourself short. Even if you're a new translator, you can't, you know, it doesn't do any good for any of us if you say, well, I just want the experience, so I'm going to say that I'm going to charge 2 cents a word or something like that, because it doesn't say much for your quality, and also it brings down the value of the work in general. So I would say, like I said, start reaching out to different agencies, look at LSPs. Usually you can apply on their website, and you can get experience through that. It would be especially helpful if you had some sort of subject area specialty, whether that be a degree you got or something you're very proficient in, that could help you find jobs. Does anybody else have any advice? It's the best I could say.
I would say if there is an agency that you are applying to or looking to work with, having a couple sample translations ready to go, you know, would be helpful in that case. You know, they might want some kind of specific text as a sample translation. So having a couple that you could pull from, like, you know, a fake, you know, kind of like a birth certificate or a news article or a legal statement or something like that, or maybe like a medical document or something like that. Nothing with real people's information on it, obviously. Maybe you could replace the names, numbers, dates with false information just to use as a sample, but that is definitely something that helps get people's attention faster.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. That's very good advice. Yeah, and of course it would be practice. I mean, any practice is good, especially if there's a certain field you are interested in working in, not necessarily general translation, but certain text types or certain, like I said, fields. Take texts from that, whether it be news articles or manuals, and yeah, create a couple sample translations for yourself. Any other questions?
What is the organization that you mentioned for translation, Ustad?
I'm sorry?
We're one of them. We're one organization that offers document translation, but there are a lot of organizations that, language service providers that offer translation. So if it's something that you want to find a lot more agencies to work with, I would suggest like Google translating, or it's not Google translating, just using a search engine to look up document translation agencies or companies. That's going to help you find places. But locally in Buffalo, there's International Institute of Buffalo, and Journey's End Refugee Services also offers document translation. But there's tons of national and international language service providers that offer translation.
Yeah, and they all vary in size too. So there's some really big LSPs, language service providers, that are companies like Lionbridge or Morningside, that have a really large pool of linguists that they use. And then there are smaller ones that you could apply to as well. I also heard of some other ones. I know some people who have worked for something called MotaWord, which is crowdsourced translation, and you're basically paid by how many words you do. You just log in and translate segments. It's kind of interesting. I'm not quite sure exactly how it works because I've never done it myself, but it might be worth checking out if you wanted to start translation.
Robin actually made a good point in the chat. She said a lot of groups that help asylum seekers need volunteer translators. You can get experience through them. And yeah, that's a really good point. Even just the other day, I was sharing the flyer for this, and I saw in interpreter and translator Facebook groups, people posting looking for volunteer interpreters and translators. Because there are a lot of places that they're run on donations and grant funding, and they don't necessarily have the funding available to pay for translation. So they look for volunteer translators. So while it's not ideal to always volunteer your services because it is skilled labor and you deserve to be compensated, getting experience starting out, I think volunteering is a good way to kind of grease the wheels and build your confidence.
I'm sorry, I can't see chat on my computer. Have anyone mentioned the freelance sites where people find customers like ProZ, like Translators Cafe, and well, Upwork. Upwork is like not the best for translators, but it's still there.
Not yet, but that I can't believe that neither Ryan or I mentioned those things. But ProZ or ProZ, depending on where you're from, is really great. If you haven't been on there, you should get on there and sign up and list yourself, because you know, even myself, like I've gotten lots of emails from people on there like looking for interpreters and translators, and you know, you have to be careful, watch out for people trying to pull one over on you. But there are a lot of freelance websites where you can list yourself and people can just reach out to you by email or phone and contact you.
And I reach out to people on ProZ or ProZ or ProZ or however it's called all the time. Another place you can register is I think it only works if you're a member, but ATA. I don't know if anybody is a member. Membership isn't necessarily cheap, but it's also a way to get on their list. I find people from ATA all the time, and it is a useful it's a useful organization to be a member of if you're interested in getting clients and working as a freelance translator or interpreter.
And since, sorry, ATA is expensive indeed, but it has local branches. I'm a member of Notice, the Pacific Northwest branch, and it's far more affordable.
Oh yes, there's I remember there was one in Northeast Ohio. They also had, it was like a branch. I don't remember if it was its own, but yeah, associations like that are very useful for finding work because people reach out to you. Oh, we have a good comment. Before you accept any offers of freelance work, check the company's review. Be careful. Very definitely be careful, because people some people have not been paid for their work. I agree.
Exactly. Or they will ghost you, or they will just call you for this one thing, and then you will never hear from them. You never know when they're going to pay you, which is the worst part. So be careful, please.
I wanted to, Agatha, what was the name of the organization that you mentioned? Notice?
The Pacific Northwest? Yes, Notice, Notis.
Thank you. I'll share that in the chat. But I think it looks like we've got no more questions related to the content. A couple people were asking about the recording. Yes, it will be shared probably within the next 2 weeks. You know, we'll edit it down and make sure any of the audio issues were edited out, and certificates for those who did purchase them or get donation tickets, they'll get them by email within the next few days. I'll also send out an evaluation, so you can, if you have some thoughts or feedback about the course, you can submit that as well. But I think if everybody is feeling good and ready to head out, I think that was it. Thank you so much for coming, everyone, and thank you so much to Ryan for all the hard work and effort he put into putting this presentation together. It's really impressive. I learned a significant amount from this, even as somebody who's taken translation classes and gone to school for linguistics. I learned a lot from this, so thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Bye, thanks. Bye, thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good one.